This is the second webinar in a series that is being hosted by the International Demand-Led Breeding Project. This is an alliance of key partners in Australia and Africa that's aiming to transform African agriculture in the area of crop improvement through producing customer-focused, high-performing crop varieties. But I will let Professor Hussein Shamalis tell you some more about that. My name is Christine Queno from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and I work with the Alumni Association for Agricultural Graduates, and I'll be assisting as the technical host for this meeting. So I'll drop in between speakers just to give them a quick introduction, keep things flowing and keep things to time. I know we have very in-depth topics. I'm sure it's going to be tricky for our speakers to limit what they have to say. I will now hand over to Professor Hussein Shamalis. He's the South African Sugarcane Research Institute Chair of Crop Science at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, the Deputy Director of the African Centre of Crop Improvement, and a member of the DLB team. I'm sure he's a very familiar face, so I didn't even need to introduce him, but he will tell us more about the DLB project. So over to you, Prof.
All right. Thank you, Christine. I appreciate for the brief introductions, and I should thank everyone present for this webinar. We appreciate everyone present today, and thank you for joining in the DLB webinar series 2, which is making the case for investing in demand-led plant breeding in Southern Africa. And the UKZN, the ACCI, is coordinating the event in collaboration with the international team of DLB. So especially I should welcome our distinguished keynote speakers. Thank you very much indeed for sharing your valuable time, knowledge, longer-term experience, and your influence in the research and development in plant breeding and the seed industry in the region and internationally. Thank you indeed for accepting this service as a keynote speaker and for guiding the plant breeding research and development community, which is from various regions of Africa, and some of the participants are in fact international participants during this dialogue. And also participants, I'm sure we got more and are still coming in. Those who are still around, thank you very much for your presence. We really value your presence here. We have got diverse participants from the public and private sector plant breeding, the educators, research and development managers, and our alumni, the DLB alumni, and some policy makers as well. So we have lined up very interesting topics for today's webinar. Indeed, Christine will be describing about some of the profiles of our speakers, but we have got very interesting talk on the landscape of the seed industry. We use some examples in South Africa. You know, South Africa has a very vibrant seed sector in Africa, so we will learn about the landscapes of the seed sector, which is very important for plant breeding programs. Then the need for sustainable investment in plant breeding, which is a very key issue. So what are really the benefits and some of the cases for us to make the investment in plant breeding sustainable? Then we will be updated about the plant breeding, the current issues and challenges of plant breeding in Africa and internationally as well. So that will be given us as a very important, concise summaries. We will be also listening on the value of partnership, research partnership, whether it's local, regional, or international partnership based on the CG center's experience, working with the NARS and many other issues. That's really important. Then in the end, we have a talk about climate change, which is a very important driver of plant breeding these days, as you know. So we'll hear about the climate change and what breeders should do related with the climate change. Then we will have a discussion session, and then in the end, we'll make a closure. So you may ask me now, what value should I get? Is it really worth listening of the webinar? Yes, indeed. There are quite a number of values that you can gain from this webinar. One is really, we will have lessons and experience on plant breeding in the seed industry, especially the current status of the plant breeding in the seed industry. We will listen the economic, social, and environmental benefits or the impact of plant breeding at large from the keynote speakers. In the end, we will collect some cases. We will have some cases for creating compelling business cases for investment in demand-led plant breeding. So the goal is that you have a project, a demand-led plant breeding project. You needed money or investment into that. So, but for us to make those cases or investment scenarios, what are really the values? What are the inputs required there? And definitely we will get some of those elements from this webinar. So I think in the end, thank you, Christine, really for now and before for organizing this event, for excellent coordination and networking. Really, the LB team behind the curtain is also thanking you at large. Thank you very much, Christine. Okay, no, thanks very much. It will be a very quick because it's really the most important thing to describe about the background. So on this slide, you will see the title, the case for investing in the LB, demand-led breeding in Southern Africa. Indeed, it's not necessarily in Southern Africa. It can be on regional basis. So thank you. I have been introduced enough by Christine from the University of KwaZulu-Natal. I'm the staff member in the ACCI. I have to make two important notes on this presentation, on this webinar. I think we want to make the case for investing in DLB, demand-led breeding in Southern Africa. There are two cases here. I have highlighted the investment scenario and at the same time also what is demand-led breeding. In the interest of some of you who has not heard about demand-led breeding, or for some of you who know about DLB, but you want to know the updates, progress so far, I think I have to explain briefly what DLB is. So demand-led breeding is related with African plant breeding and international partnership. And as you know, food insecurity is an issue in Africa. And most of our population is food insecure. So we expect that agriculture, especially plant breeding, should make a difference in terms of ensuring food security. The challenge is now, is plant breeding doing enough in terms of delivering modern crop varieties and ensuring food security in Africa? I think the answer can be otherwise. It can be different, because when you closely see the adoption rate, the uptake of new varieties in Africa, it's really very, very low, which is less than 35%. So DLB, the demand-led breeding, the aim is pretty clear, that to make the business of plant breeding in Africa more responsive to customer requirements. It means that the new varieties must be adopted by smallholder farmers and the markets, the local or regional markets. So that's really the motive behind the DLB. Indeed, DLB also is really looking forward to make the business of plant breeding, its education, research and development based on demand-led approaches, which means when you design a new variety for release and registration and commercialization, we need to have correct product profile. And that profile requires several inputs from clients, the stakeholders, the value chain, and non-technical experts. So in short, DLB is to make the business of breeding in Africa market or demand-led. And it focuses on the business of plant breeding as such. So the approach, the initiative of DLB is based on international partnership. As I said, we have the Australian partners who included from which is funded through Australian government, the Crawford Fund, and coordinated by the University of Queensland. And then we have Syngenta Foundation from Switzerland, which is our second partner. And then many of African partners, you can see the logos on my slide, and quite a lot of them from the onset. So it's as an international partnership. So what are the core values of DLB and what are the core principles? The core values of DLB are three important areas: the education or our training, then the breeding itself, that in terms of variety design and product profiling and the use of the technology, should ally, our breeding itself should ally with the right design, the right product profile, and the use of correct breeding technologies. And lastly, the policy or political support. Given education, breeding, and the policy support, we can really make plant breeding demand oriented. The principles are also straightforward. In DLB, principles are that demand-led breeders should have clear breeding goals. They should set the breeding goals. They should know their clients. They should also design or produce a product with a correct design and profile. And demand-led breeders should have a clear strategy and stage plan. And they should make also cases for investment in their breeding programs. And those DLB breeders who are demand-oriented follow the monitoring, evaluation, and learning principles, because this is not really mostly included in most of our breeding programs. In the end, DLB, demand-led breeders, are focused on return on investment. That return can be food security. The return can be monetary gains from the breeding project. So these are the core principles. So what resources do we have so far? We have got very clearly defined resources. You can't believe DLB started in 2012, but in that short period of time, we have got very good resources, educated resources, including a textbook, which we call it the gospel or the Quran of demand-led breeding, or the business of plant breeding. So this is available now from the internet freely, so you can access this website. We have developed product profile as a toolbox for the young and practitioners to guide them as a template in terms of the developing a product profile. We have also trained many professionals, more than 400, using more than 24 workshops in Africa, Australia, and also Asia. We have got a community of practice based on this endeavor. And we have also included the DLB approach in most of our academic institutions, in the curriculum of the academic institutions. We are in the process of deploying DLB principles and practices in the public and private sectors, and I think that's going on despite this pandemic. Now, we have got a Pan-African hub, which is coordinated, based in Kenya at the Alliance for Biodiversity and SEAD. We have got a dedicated website, which is here, indicated here, where you can access the resources, the publications, and the community of practice, listing the community of practice. So this webinar is really emphasizing, in the end, from the webinar, as I said earlier, it's about investment in demand-led breeding. Because as most of you know, really, it's assumed, there is a perception that breeding is considered as a cost rather than an investment. So we need to make that change. We need to make that perception. And that has to be done through justifying that a new demand-led breeding project is an investment, not an expenditure on the funders or the institute's budget. But the challenge is for the young and emerging breeders, how do you make those cases? How do they justify that the breeding projects are indeed, they are an investment, not an expenditure? And this requires several inputs, and these inputs are understanding the values of benefits of the breeding project involved, and at the same time also the costs involved in that project. So once we know the values, the benefits, and the costs, we need to balance this to justify investment in a new variety development. Remember, there are alternative options that can be used for improving productivity. So is it better to use alternative options or to use demand-led breeding project? So we have to justify and we have to make the cases for investment. So all in all, this webinar now, the purpose of this webinar is just to share some lessons and experience on plant breeding in the seed sector and its economic, social, and environmental benefits to create cases, business cases for investment in demand-led breeding. As you know, demand-led breeding is based on multiple partners. So this is the initiative and the main reason for arranging this webinar. Thank you, Christine. I hope I haven't taken much time. Thanks.
So our first speaker is Dr. Lakeshni Chetty. Thank you for joining us, Lakeshni. She is the General Manager of the South African National Seed Organization, known as SANSOR.
Okay, yes. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Christine, my colleagues, participants. As Christine said, I'm Lakeshni, I'm from SANSOR, and today I'm going to talk about the landscape of the South African seed industry and the supports rendered by SANSOR. I'm going to start with a little bit of SANSOR. Who are we? We were established in 1989 as a result of the rationalization of the National Department of Agriculture then that said they didn't want to do the seed certification. They didn't want to hold seed certification within the department anymore. And the South African seed industry came together and said seed certification is absolutely imperative to a successful seed industry. And therefore, SANSOR was formed and became the national designated authority for seed certification in South Africa. Today, SANSOR can administer the South African seed scheme, the OECD seed scheme, as well as the the United States American seed scheme. I have about 120 members, of which approximately 78 are fully fledged seed companies. What is a fully fledged seed company? It is a company that has to be registered with the department and can breed or produce or sell import-export seed to a farmer. As SANSOR, we have widespread national and international representation. I've just listed here a few of the bodies we are represented on: the International Seed Federation, the African Seed Trade Association, the International Society for Seed Testing, the OECD, we have Euroseeds, we have the Asia Pacific, numerous organizations where SANSOR is pretty active. Basically, we are the single industry voice piece on all seed matters, be it all South African seed matters. As a team, we're 9 people. Next month, we will be 10 people. I have a young person joining us next month. The kind of services we offer: seed certification. I told you already, we administer the scheme. We provide phytosanitary support services, and this also includes opening markets into various countries. If companies need to export seed to a particular country, we try and open that market. We facilitate research that is beneficial to the South African seed industry. We do a lot of policy inputs and regulation advocacy issues. We collect annually seed sales data for South African seed companies. We also collect ARC license fees. So the ARC, you know, within the South African seed space breed numerous varieties. They license this out to seed companies. We collect that for them. We advocate on numerous issues such as, you know, the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources, on plant breeding innovation, which I'll touch on later. So we consider ourselves an advocate of the seed industry. We run a huge capacity development program where we give out bursaries to agriculture seed-related topics. We also try and place graduates at various companies. We also do soft skills training with these young graduates so that we can have that transition into an employment area a lot easier for both the employee and the employer. And we do a lot of industry training, one of which you might know already is the seed inspector course for seed certification. So that is just a few of the things we do. Give me a second. So here I want to just tell you what is the global seed industry. And I always refer to it as the global seed industry because no seed business can really function as an island. Even if you're a South African company, you're just selling to the general South African farmer, you still have to abide by international norms, which many countries have to abide by. And these international norms are there to ensure that we can trade efficiently. So I always try to refer to the seed industry as the global seed industry, of which there are two major players. One is the seed company that needs to supply to the farmer, and then the farmer who is the recipient of the seed. Things that a seed company have to take into consideration. Food and nutritional security. It is imperative that we produce seed and breed seed that provides for our food and nutritional security needs. They are concerned about synchrony in regulations. Because we're a global industry, we need synchronized regulations when it comes to GMOs, phytosanitary regulations, import and export conditions, new breeding techniques. Next is access to genetic resources. How do we ensure the industry can continuously breed and have access to important genetic resources that can provide you a good end product? How do we make sure we have a return on investment? And I like to use the example 20 years ago, plus minus. I don't want to give away my age now. We had the Nokia 3310 and we were all blown over by how incredible the cell phone was. Today we have smartphones that can do video call, it accesses internet, you can do just about everything except make you a cup of coffee, but you can order a cup of coffee online. How did we get a company going from a 3310 to a smartphone? It's because they were able to invest. They were able to invest in new technology. No different is the seed industry. How do we give out those new products? And how do you get your intellectual property protection? If you do not have intellectual property protection, you will not have innovation. Innovation needs to know, you need to know as an innovator that your rights will be protected and you can reinvest going forward. Phyto issues. You cannot move seed without phytosanitary challenges. And what is the point of breeding seed if you cannot move it from point A to point B? And then we have to be focused on consumer and dietary trends. Interestingly, when the pandemic started early last year, we saw a big shift in dietary trends. A lot of people were focused on being healthy and drinking lemon water and turmeric water, increasing their vegetables in their diet. And we saw a strong shift towards veganism. And this is something the seed industry needs to consider when they breed. Farmers, they want competitive varieties. They are focused on yield. They're also focused on disease protection, pest protection. They need to be as competitive in this country with a farmer in Argentina or the US. So competitive varieties. They need high quality, healthy seed, but they also want the right to save seed. It is their right, they're entitled to, and it's important to them. So this slide, I want to just touch on again, the complexities of the global seed trade. We will have, for example, a particular seed, sorry, my slide is a bit frozen here. There we go. A breeding, a line could be bred in a European country, for example, taken to another country for production, taken back or to another country for processing, to another country for packing, and then to other markets. That is how complex the seed industry is. And it's something that breeders need to consider when they are breeding, that their product has to be able to move around the globe. So these are the aspects that are important within seed certification, within the seed system, one of which is seed certification. What is certified seed? Certified seed, in a nutshell, is seed of consistently high and known quality, genetically and physically, that's produced according to certain regulations. And you need to be able to provide proof of the certification. What are the benefits? Those of you who are here from a seed company, I do not need to elaborate on the benefits. Nonetheless, you get more than 90 controlled checkpoints. It's independently monitored. There's a complete record. And most importantly, when the product is sold to a processor or to a market, they know they are getting a quality of a high standard because it came from certified seed. This is absolutely critical for breeders to understand. Your seed, your product, once bred and ready for the pipeline, must go through a certification process. This is a little graphic description of the South African seed industry. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but key things, you start with breeder seed. You have a field inspection. It goes through all the processes before it's registered and it gets to the farmer. The next most important thing is intellectual property and plant breeders' rights. These are the kind of infringements we see from a seed business perspective. Brown bagging, counterfeit seed, very common in other African countries. The selling of grain as seed, selling a variety under a false name or somebody else's name. This is governed under the Plant Improvement Act. Selling seed without a license. You have to get the permission of the breeder to sell your seed. You also need to agree with him under what name you will sell it, and then conditioning seed for the purposes of propagation without a license. These are illegal seed practices. What does this cause? Massive losses, not just financial losses, reputational losses to a seed company. Losses to the farmer, because he's going to most likely plant something that's not real seed. It's going to impact food security. And then farm-safe seed. When a farmer retains seed, I said to you already, it is his right to do so. It impacts a seed company's ability to reinvest in breeding. How would you get new products if a company is unable to sell seed year after year? For that, in South Africa, we developed the South African Cultivar and Technology Agency. This organization we started in 2015. We call it SACTA. And this was as a result that after decades of farm-safe seed, companies did not introduce new varieties. There was just no way a company could financially invest to bring out new varieties. And that's when the farmers came to Santo and said, hey, we need new varieties, we're prepared to pay for it. And this is what we call an endpoint royalty. The system exists in Australia, in France, a little bit in South America. This is the first for Africa, where we had instituted a levy for breeding and technology, specifically on open pollinated crops, because these are the crops that is continuously retained by a farmer. So wheat, barley, oats, soybean, and recently we introduced lupins. This levy is distributed to seed companies based on their market share. So basically the seed company that owns that variety, that has that plant breeders' rights on that variety. And that company redirects those funds directly into their breeding programs. And since its inception, we have seen numerous varieties come onto the market as a result of this investment. It goes to show how important investment in breeding is. What is this new era of innovation? We started with traditional breeding hundreds of years ago. We moved into molecular breeding, marker-assisted breeding, GMOs. This new era of plant breeding innovation contains new breeding techniques. Techniques such as genome editing, like CRISPR-Cas, where breeders can breed more precisely in a less amount of time. So more specific issues can be dealt with, more specific traits in a much shorter period of time. This has always been driven by science. However, plant breeding innovation, much like GMOs or any other regulatory issue, requires regulations and policies. Without the harmonization of these policies, farmers will be disadvantaged, the layman will be disadvantaged, countries are going to be disadvantaged. Harmonization of these policies across the globe, across the region are important so that we can move seed across borders. If we breed something in South Africa, we need for it to have benefits to farmers across the continent, at the very least. And these different regulations are going to cause massive food security issues and huge regulatory challenges. The point I want to make here that it's important that plant breeders take ownership of their products and these processes and make input on these policies that affect them. If you're going to breed something, breed it for the right reasons and so that it could reach the farmer and its benefit. What is our role in the fall? In the beginning, I told you the many services we offer. Just to summarize that, we will play a role in facilitating research. I try to encourage universities to keep us alongside your processes while you're dealing so we can guide you on route to market. We advocate that regulations are based on sound scientific principles. I cannot emphasize this strong enough. We try to facilitate solutions on trade barrier issues. We are great advocates of intellectual property, and we want to ensure that we do not see the kind of infringements we see in other countries. We represent the industry on the culture and technology agencies. Ultimately, we want to ensure that farmers receive quality seed, be it a farmer here in South Africa, a farmer in Egypt, whomever it might be. Ultimately, we are here to ensure the uninterrupted movement of high quality seed so that we can support food security. Thank you. Christine, that's it from me.
Great, thank you, Lakeshni. I see we are a little bit ahead of schedule, so there is a question from Prof. Lang for you in the chat box.
Okay, I'll just read out the question. It's from Professor Mark Lang. What about IP protection for novel self-pollinating crops or vegetatively propagated crops? How can we make this happen so it becomes worthwhile for commercial seed companies to breed and distribute these crops? I think this is a really, really important question, and we're dealing with such a variety of crops. I think the first thing is you have to get plant breeders' rights. Once you get plant breeders' rights and you have established a market that is, you see that farmers are showing a demand and they're showing, how can I say, a need for that product, and they want a variation of the varieties of that particular crop. So for example, if it's a wheat, we want wheat that can do this, or wheat can do that, and you start bringing out new varieties. I think certainly the Cultivar and Technology Agency can be approached to include certain crops so that we can collect levies and reinvest to breed. We need to hear from farmers to say that this is what they need and what they are prepared to pay a levy on. I think there's another question. Or is it somebody?
Yes, there is another one which says, how can breeders have a greater voice and input into seed policy in South Africa? How do breeders?
Yes. I think, well, there's the South African Plant Breeders Association that is a representative body of plant breeders. That's one arena, but also through SANSOR. We have an intellectual property standing committee at SANSOR, And through that committee, through the industry, plant breeders must make their voice heard.
Yes. Then the next question is, who pays for the sector? Who pays for the sector? Farmers or traders?
So the farmers pay a levy. So when a farmer delivers his grain at a silo, a levy is paid per ton, and that levy is passed on to sector, who distributes it to seed companies to invest in breeding.
Excellent. All right. Thank you. Prof. Lang, you can speak. Are you happy with the response regarding self-pollinated crops like wheat and barley and vegetatively reproducing crops like cassava and others in terms of the intellectual property, or do you have any vision that it should be done? You can unmute yourself and talk.
Yeah, I think the problem I can see is that it's okay for crops like soybeans and wheat, which are delivered to a relatively few silos, and therefore it's relatively easy to do this. I think we've got a real challenge with vegetatively propagated crops because they tend to get sold locally. So something like a sweet potato, how do you actually apply a levy to sweet potatoes? Because they're going to get sold to municipal markets, national markets, or directly to the supermarket chains. So other than government, who does it on a non-profit basis, essentially, why would a seed company get involved in the production and distribution and initial breeding of these vegetative crops? Because I can't see how you're going to apply a levy on these crops.
So, Prof. Shimilis, can I go ahead?
Yes, go ahead, please. Yes.
Yes. So I think the levy system we know works well for these particular crops. The point I was trying to make is, if we work together as farmers, industry, government, storage facilities, we can come up with a solution. And let me say, it took us a long while to come up with the solution. This was almost 6, 7, 8 years in the making, and we had numerous challenges, even though we had a willing payer and a willing breeder involved. These are exceptionally challenging discussions, and they are sensitive issues. The word levy itself is pretty frightening. It sounds like an e-toll kind of fee. So my first suggestion is that we need to come together as farmers to say, I am not satisfied with the sweet potato varieties I have. And we need those people who do. I unfortunately don't represent companies that produce these particular crops, but whoever they are, and say, well, this is what it's going to need. What are your needs? Then they have to internally discuss, well, can we give them what we need? What would it cost? And then work together. It's very important. The collaborative effort is, you can't quit on that. And believe me, there were many times we as seed industry would have liked to quit. We banged heads many times, but we didn't quit in those discussions, and we eventually got a sector which is working well. Make no mistake, we will still bang heads, but we have to sometimes put aside our own head banging issues to look at the benefit for the country. I think it's worthwhile looking at the model and finding a different solution. Another idea one could put in is, what are the licensing mechanisms? Is that a way? Could one sign separate individual agreements with farmers? There are opportunities that can be hashed out and suited more for the sweet potato farmer. I think there are opportunities, but Mark, it takes guts and perseverance.
Thank you. I think we have to go back to Christine, to you.
Thank you, Lekeshni. I think that addresses all the questions, but if there are further questions for Lekeshni, please continue to put them in the chat box or hold on to them until our discussion at the end. Next speaker is Dr. Rufaro Madakadze, the Senior Program Officer in Extension and Capacity Building at the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, or AGRA. and she will be speaking about making the case for sustainable investments in plant breeding and seed systems in Africa. In her role as capacity building lead for all programs at AGRA, her prior role, she managed over 17 education and training programs in Africa, trained over 1,700 people, which included hundreds of postgraduate students in crop improvement, including here at UKZN and the ACCI. Lots of research technicians and professionals across Africa in the seed sector. She's a seed scientist herself from Zimbabwe and received her training in the United States and Canada before going on to teach at the universities of Zimbabwe and Zululand. And she has served on South Africa's National Research Foundation Agriculture Panel, the CTA Science and Technology Advisory Board, and the Makerere University Centre for Crop Improvement and West Africa Centre for Crop Improvement Advisory Boards. She's passionate about working with smallholder farmers, which I'm sure she will tell us about. And she has numerous publications in the areas of horticulture, seed science, and capacity building. So great presentation. We're looking forward to it. Thank you so much, Rufaro. Over to you.
Thank you. Am I unmuted? Can you hear me?
We can hear you loud and clear and see you.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you. As introduced, my name is Rufaro. I am going to talk to us today about making the case for sustainable investments in plant breeding and seed systems in Africa. Yes, this is an interesting topic. I'm going to share on the need for improved seed systems in Africa, and I'm going to use a lot of examples from the work we have done in as the Program for Africa Seed Systems in Africa of AGRA. I will talk about the impact of investments in plant breeding and education, strengthening NAS research, strengthening local seed companies, seed producers, developing seed and other inputs, distribution network, and looking at the last mile delivery of not only seed, but also of knowledge, raising awareness to the farmers. And I will finalize by talking about a few final thoughts on how this can be sustained. AGRA is an African-led association that is working to make sure that we have a food secure and prosperous future for all Africans. We are pushing innovation-driven productivity and access to markets. We are putting smallholder farmers at the center of the continent's growing economy, and we are working to transform agriculture from a solitary struggle to a thriving business. And our headline goals are doubling the incomes of 9 million farm households and doubling the incomes of another 21 million through partnerships and supporting a pathway to attain and sustain agricultural transformation. So transformation starts with a seed. It is fueled by good fertilizer. It is sustained by structured markets. And when we look at the seed, research and development is really the lifeblood of that seed industry. If we don't have research and development, we don't have the seed developed. We don't have anything even to talk about. And skilled researchers generate and disseminate these technologies for farmers, and these technologies need to get to the intended users through last mile deliveries, which can be agro dealers, extension agents, community-based advisors. Looking at the seed systems, I'm going to just use the Tasai example. They talked about a seed system comprising of 4 main components, but you can pretty much add some other things there. But the first one, these are the main components, is research and variety development in Africa, which is mainly done by NAS. In North America and Europe, it's mainly done by the private sector. Then we look at variety registration and release, which is mainly government. And we have seen even the seed industries, seed agencies. We then look at seed production and processing and packaging, which is mainly private sector purview and looking at seed marketing, sales and trade, seed companies, agro dealers, which is mainly private sector, but we know in Africa we are getting government also playing a role, especially in subsidies when there are issues. Now going back to breeding. In Africa, breeding, not only in Africa, in the world, breeding is actually the key engine that develops the technologies. And it's critical to actually make sure that these technologies are developed right. In Africa, we are dealing with diverse agroecologies. So we need broadly and specifically adapted varieties. We need the breeders to understand the market demands of the products. Hence, we are talking in that they develop. Not only the market we are talking about includes smallholder farmers, include the industry, includes everyone who uses the products that come from the breeding, hence the demand-led breeding approach. We have a diverse food base in Africa, with mainly rain-fed systems, segmented political landscapes, and underinvestment. But this diversity and uncertain conditions represent a major implication for increasing crop yields across a broad area of the continent. It means we have to be very strategic in how we address our breeding priorities. Looking at the capacity building, just going through the four, 5 topics I talked about that we worked on as AGRA. Looking at capacity building in 2006, there were 500 plant breeders in about 14 countries that we worked in. Little or no dedication plant breeding programs in African universities. I think there was only the ACCI, which was training plant breeders at PhD level. And a few scattered institutions who were training 1 person, 2 people a year. And the WASI had just started, the West Africa plant breeding was just starting. The NAS that are all over Africa needed better trained staff with broader and enhanced skills. This is just mainly to ensure a steady stream of improved varieties are released, multiplied, and accessible to farmers. So what AGRA did in the program that I led was to provide funding for the training of scientists, research technicians, and seed enterprise personnel to address smallholder farmer problems on priority African staple crops in Africa. So we funded 13 MSc programs and 2 PhD plant breeding programs, including the ACCI and the West Africa Center for Crop Improvement in 14 institutions in sub-Saharan Africa. The funding basically included full scholarships and infrastructure to ensure the quality of the programs was good. And one of the key elements that has made us able to track the impact of this work is AGRA provided follow-on funding on a competitive basis to trained plant breeders who had a case, who were showing that the work they developed in their research, it can actually be developed up to variety release. And we actually have a lot of stories to talk about because of that. And these are basically the numbers of people trained, over 500 people. So if we were talking a plain level field where people do not die or retire, we could have said we doubled the numbers of plant breeders on the continent. We increased the numbers of female scientists trained from about 16% to about 40% for MSc, 31% for PhD. And the scientists worked on a wide range of crops. You can see this is really large. We also, as I said, we also funded the other seed systems personnel. Research technician training was done at the East Africa, for East and Southern Africa, at the Namlonge in Uganda, and for West Africa at IITA for the Anglophone and ICRISAT for the Francophone program. The training, this training actually trains research technicians on the theory and practical exercises of plant breeding, including ethics. A lot of the research technicians we work with, they know how to do things. They don't know why they are doing it, and they don't understand some of the background behind. So this course has really opened their minds and actually ensures that we have good results that are generated. 152 technicians were trained from 18 countries. Then we also funded the UC Davis African Plant Breeding Academy for training, which trains mid-career plant breeders. The courses they use are developed by personnel who teach private sector plant breeders in the US, in Europe, and Asia. And this short course training teaches public sector breeders on product development and modern plant breeding methodologies. We found a lot of the PhD plant breeders we had funded really enjoying this course. They thought, I heard people say, I thought I understood, I thought I had reached the top of my career, but after this course, their training was grounded into proper plant breeding. It's kind of like the AGRA of the professional qualification of breeding, if you want. Then we also funded the training of seed company personnel conducted by the Seed Enterprise Management Institute at the University of Nairobi. This program was expanded to Senegal, to South Sudan, and to Rwanda. The personnel, we're talking of training of seed production managers, processing managers, the owners of the seed companies in business, and over 1,000 people were trained. So basically the impact is that we moved from 1 or 2 institutions that were training plant breeders to over 10 programs that are still, even now, 4 or 5 years after the funding, continuing to train plant breeders at postgraduate levels. The trained scientists have released over 300 varieties, including some of the first sweet potato varieties ever released in Burkina Faso, the first hybrid pearl millet released, the first finger millet varieties released in East Africa. And when you look at even the numbers of people that have been contributed, we conducted a survey looking at how many people are in the NAS, what are they contributing, what is AGRA's contribution. And from this, we did the study in 11 countries. From this, we actually found that the trained plant breeders constitute greater than 40 to 50% of all active plant breeders in NAS of Rwanda, of Malawi, of Mozambique, of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. So it's not just contributing numbers, it's contributing human resources that are generating technologies. In West Africa alone, the trained plant breeders that are in the NAS have actually brought to their institutions over $35 million from the grants they look for. I think this is something I think we should actually use as an indicator of actually how it's our part of the impact of the work we are doing. The trained scientists are managing over 60% of the national plant breeding research in their respective countries, and they are training hundreds of other plant breeders and technicians in their home countries. So when we look at, we gave grants, we gave funding, but when we look at how do we sustain this, we realize that there's need to explore new models of funding that include the governments, that include regional blocks, that include the private sector. In all the programs that we worked in, there were only 3 countries that were actually funding some of their own scientists for postgraduate training. That's Mozambique, that's Tanzania, and Burkina Faso. But if the governments do not take ownership of the programs, it's a problem. So we need actually to advocate for governments to take ownership. We need the private sector to to play a role in funding even some of the people they need. What we have seen is the private sector goes into the public sector and picks the best trained and lures them there without really investing back into the system. We also need to focus on orphan crops that do not have major investments by donors and ensure the diversity of African crops. This will improve resilience, this will improve the relevance to the continent. And we also need to leverage NAS and CG centers for postgraduate student training and research supervision. We have actually seen that some of the NAS and some of the CG centers are able to access resources that NAS do not have. So if universities partner with these, they can jointly look for money, advocate private sector, government, whoever to get more resources. Then the other program we did was for funding plant breeders in the NAS. The objective was to develop and release improved crop varieties with a focus on the major staple crops in Africa. We were using participatory plant breeding approaches in various agroecologies to facilitate adoption and utilization of these. We funded over 100 breeding programs. It's very small grants, $150 to $200,000 over a period of 3 years in over 18 countries. The funding included operational costs of running a breeding program, in most cases up to early generation seed production. It included infrastructure support because a lot of the NAS were collapsing. There was no infrastructure. And we actually had over 685 climate smart and resilient varieties released. 60% of these are commercialized. The numbers of varieties released, it continues to increase. I'm quite sure this was about 2019. I'm quite sure we've passed the 700 mark. The traits developed disease and insect resistance, drought tolerance, early maturity, nutrient efficiency, which are all critical, especially when we talk of climate change. This has resulted in replacement of old varieties and yield increases for maize from about 1.5 to over 3 metric tons. For when we are talking this number for Southern Africa, it looks very small, but we are coming from areas where the yields of maize in some countries was less than 8 ton per hectare. And this work has facilitated germplasm sharing. It has facilitated networking of breeders, which is critical. So some of the key lessons we've learned from here is that we need to have formalized public-private partnerships between public breeding and the private seed producers. We found out that the varieties that are developed by breeders that work with the private sector are actually very good. They can be commercialized. You don't have problems of differences in milking times. You don't have problems of adoption because the private sector already knows, it's already invested in this variety, and it can quickly be commercialized and sent to be produced by farmers. So it's also critical to ensure a healthy flow of newly released crop varieties from NAS reaches the private sector and reaches the farmers. And this facilitates the building of capacity of the private seed companies to produce foundation seed, to produce certified seed that is used by farmers. You see, for AGRA, all our focus is the smallholder farmers. Then the next intervention we did is to invest in local seed companies. The mandate here was to support seed production and dissemination initiatives. This entailed identification and funding of promising enterprises, mentoring and linking them to public breeding institutions for acquisition of varieties, also mentoring and linking them to finance. The seed entrepreneurs that we supported fall into 2 categories. They were local private seed companies and public companies. Of 110 seed companies, we worked with 110 seed companies from about 11 in 2006. Is that a sign that I finished my time? No? Okay, that's good. From about 11 in 2006. And these are homegrown seed companies. We know that the multinational seed companies are big and they're getting in many different places. But when you have a homegrown seed company, it's not affected by politics. It's not affected by the people out there who are determining whether we should continue working in Cameroon because of this and that. But so when you have your own homegrown seed companies, they have nowhere to run away if there are problems. So this really helps. We have actually now having these homegrown seed companies producing 70% of the seed grown in their countries. No more imports in most countries, and the volume of seed produced is over 600,000 metric tons from only 2,000 metric tons in 2006. We have also attracted more seed companies, even when you actually have a functional seed system, even the multinationals also want to come, and that have invested over 300 million US dollars and established early generation seed production models in Ethiopia, in Nigeria, in Uganda, and also working on making sure the quality of the seed is good and it can be traced through the e-tags. So in terms of other investments, it's critical to actually build the capacity for enterprise development, for enterprises to access finance at friendly rates, for building their irrigation, their mechanization, storage and processing, as well as marketing. So this will actually increase their competition with multinationals and give farmers better choices at quality. Then the other piece we looked at is really looking at the input distribution. And the goal for this was to improve the functioning. It's not enough to just produce the seed. You have to have a system, a model that makes sure this seed that is produced has a way of getting to the farmers. So the goal for this was to improve the functioning of input markets by increasing access to farm inputs for smallholder farmers through the development of agro-dealer networks. Over 40,000 agro-dealers were established or strengthened. We are now building the capacity of village-based agents to serve as agro-dealers in areas where there are no agro-dealers. This has reduced actually the distance traveled by farmers to access seeds from 30 kilometers to an average of 10 kilometers. As AGRA, our target is actually to get this to 5 kilometers. So we are not there yet, but this is important to actually fund this. And so AGRA's private sector-led agro-dealer development is quick, it's cost-effective, and it enables farmers to gain last-mile access to inputs. So looking at this is one area where we thought about how to fund this. Because we kept playing around with systems. How do we make sure that we actually have a system that works? So we started with startup grants and get credit guarantee schemes, provide incentive and mechanisms to support the new agro dealers, boost investments and operating capital in rural areas. It's all not easy, by the way. And we have also worked with the private sector in expanding agro-dealer networks for efficiency and sustainability. We have involved the hub agro-dealers, the large agro-dealers in the cities and the seed companies to actually put in system business development services, technical training of the agro-dealers, providing supplier credit, market development, all these things that are needed to grow businesses. And we have done innovative ICT tools and platforms to increase transparency and improve record keeping. It's still also a work in progress, but if we actually nail this down, then it means we have seed from the breeder to the seed company to the last miles we are talking about. And I think we all know our extension systems in Africa have collapsed. We have one extension agent reaching 3,000, 10,000 farmers, which basically means a lot of farmers never see an extension agent in a year or even some in a lifetime. So AGRA has started this extension strategy, which is private sector led, working with community-based advisors. It's not really new, but we are strengthening a system that has been there. Some called it lead farmers, some master farmers. These village-based advisors are self-employed agents. They rapidly create demand for yield-enhancing inputs. They teach farmers good agricultural practices using mother and baby demos, and they aggregate produce and linking farmers to markets. What we have seen in the last 5 years is the seed and fertilizer companies are now looking for the village-based advisors, because this has provided an avenue for advertising their produce up to village level in areas that they were not even working in. The CBAs are trained mainly by the public sector extension agents. They are also trained by the private sector companies in some areas. So when we are looking at this area, how can we make sure we have sustainable investments? We still need to advocate for government and private sector to fund extension services. We need to look at what parts of that chain can we privatize to make sure we have sustainable systems. Just an example from Mozambique within the region, looking at maize, we stratified farmers into 3 groups: struggling, moderate, and best farmers. If you look at this, a lot of the farmers that we started with before the intervention of this extension approach, most of them were using local varieties. They were not even using OPVs. But with the VBA approach, we now have most of the farmers using hybrid seeds and OPVs. And if you look at fertilizer use in Mozambique is even worse. The best farmers have actually now increased fertilizer use. When I say this, I say it a bit tongue in cheek. We are saying it increased fertilizer use. It moved from almost less than 20 kgs per hectare to 80 kilograms per hectare. It's still very low, but just training the farmers on good agronomic practices has raised awareness for the need for input use, the need for good agricultural practices, and increase the yields of the farmers from a ton or less to over 3.4 metric tons. So to cap it off, it's important to invest in great institutions. AGRA has made a huge impact on breeding and seed systems capacity and knowledge production, but there's need for more investors. We cannot really we can't be donor hopping all the time. We can't be looking at who is the biggest donor. Now Bezos has said is bringing money. We beg to Bezos to say, bring it to Africa, bring it to here. We need to have sustainable systems, homegrown systems. What AGRA did is catalyze and show that if you operate like this, you can actually build an effective seed system. But who among ourselves can pick up the investments? We need both research and enterprise development to be funded. They need finances to grow to meet the demands or the needs of the continents. As one of my friends, Prof. Mark Lang, says, there is need for continuous, reliable, and stable funding for both the capacity building and research and development to continue. When we look for money from donors, they will come, yes, they will give us money for 5 years, 10 years if we are lucky. But if you have a government that is dedicated, you have a local private sector that is dedicated to building a system that can go on for a lot longer. So we need to continue to advocate to governments to increase funding. We need to privatize specific components that can be privatized with the normal legislation that is needed to make sure it goes well. And we need to leverage partnerships with the private sector to increase funding for research and development. There are a lot of places. I went to school in the US where you actually have university professors who are working on research funded by the private sector. We are looking for models like that. Can we not have the SIDCOs, the Cotivas fund research in NAS in universities, fund the training of people in NAS and universities, fund the growth of the local seed companies within the areas to actually make sure we have sustainability. We need to leverage partnerships with the private sector, I said. We need to facilitate access to finance at good interest rates to ensure the local private sector grows and can compete with regional and multinationals. And I think it's good I'm talking after Lukeshni. It's important not to forget the policy and legislation aspects of this. Thank you very much. Ngiyabonga kakhulu, Linothenda. Thank you. That's it from me.
Rufaro, amazing presentation. As you can probably see from the chat box, and as you could see if you look through the list of participants, there are definitely people in the audience who are products of the work that AGRA has done. So I think you've inspired us, and you've also thrown down the gauntlet as a challenge for what's needed in this sector. So thank you very much. There is a question there, but we will, if it's all right with you, Enoch, we will leave that to the discussion period at the end and move on to our next speaker, just so that we keep to time. Our next speaker is Dr. Francois Kukumur. He's the Field Crop Seed Development Lead for Sub-Saharan Africa at Sensako, Syngenta Seeds. His background is in agronomy, genetics, and plant breeding, with postgraduate studies focusing on genetics and breeding of wheat. And his career began at South Africa's Agricultural Research Council Small Grain Institute before he joined Monsanto, and then Sensako, where he was Director of Research and Development until their requirement by Syngenta, when he took on his current role. He served as Director of the South African Grain Laboratory, as a member of the Wheat Technical Committee, a past President of the South African Plant Breeding Association, and he served on the management of that association as well. And he's judged young scientists at a science expo in South Africa, been a referee on several postgraduates, so MSc and PhD theses, and scientific journals, project applications. He's evaluated Summit's global strategies and research programs. And he's seen Sensako grow its market share and crop portfolio considerably, which he might touch on in his presentation. He's a very successful commercial breeder in his own right, having released 21 irrigation wheat cultivars and contributing to the relaxation of the quality parameters for the release of winter cereal cultivars, which resulted in higher yields in irrigation areas. So Dr. Kukumur is taking on the complex topic of the issues and challenges of plant breeding in Southern Africa, very broad. So take it away, please. We are looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Christine. Sense that he had an excellent plant breeder or a wheat breeder, developed a lot of varieties that's been produced right through the world, and he also won the World Food Prize a few years ago. Unfortunately, Ras passed away in February due to COVID, and I think the industry, or the plant breeding industry, had lost a giant in that sense. Well, if you look at these three slides, there's either be a commonality between them or not. I mean, if I put the next one on, for me, I think there is a commonality maybe. You can decide or guess it's either, the design of the buildings, the architecture of those buildings, or maybe nothing, or maybe the blueprint used to build these buildings. And those of you that guessed, that architecture was the commonality between all these three pictures, were definitely right. And for myself, I see, plant breeding as art and your actually architecture of plants. If you look at, I mean, anybody that design a building, the principles, I mean, you get an idea or, you know, what you want to do. Most people will then do research on that idea. They will develop a design or a blueprint for specifically, you know, creating the idea. And then after that, they will actually build that building. And at the end of the day, you will get a final product that you either sell or you build for your client that you will sell back to your client, or they will pay you for that service. And I think plant breeding is, and to a certain extent, exactly a similar process. You know, you need to have the idea, the plant breeder needs to understand the phenotype he wants to develop, and it will go through the same process to actually develop the final product. For me, personally, I think there's 4 critical pillars or principles for you know, having a successful seed company. I think firstly, experienced breeders is important on the most critical part of any breeding company. I think you have to have experienced breeders. It's a long process to develop new varieties. It's not normally a year or 2. It mostly is between 5 to 10 years, depending on the crop that you're working. And in the case of wheat, sometimes even as long as 15 years. And if you go to our forest industry, it took up to 20, 25 years, you know, to actually commercialize or develop a new variety. So continuity of breeders, I think, is the most important one. If your breeders does change a lot within a breeding program, you start almost from scratch. And I don't think, if you look at most successful seed companies, they have not a lot, or they have a good retention of their breeders, and their breeders doesn't change a lot. So they look well after their breeders. And mostly, I think nowadays, breeders are really getting good salaries due to the impact that they make in the seed company. I think the second one is your diverse germplasm. You need to have germplasm that you can actually cross and generate new cultivars. So the more diverse your germplasm is, or the more value they have, I think the better your chances will be to developing new cultivars. The third one is actually your infrastructure and breeding tools. I think the better your infrastructure is, you know, the better you will be in actually developing material. And I think also the breeding tools that you have available. You know, breeding is a numbers game, and the more numbers you can handle, the better your chances will be to get a good variety. And therefore, you need breeding tools, you need infrastructure to be able to handle these numbers. The most cost-effective way, actually, I think, you know, in handling these numbers, to identify the right variety eventually that you will commercialize. I think the last one, actually, for me is also very important, and that's something I've learned when being part of Monsanto, is networking, you know, or the networks you can rely on. People that you have learned through your many years of experience in the industry, where you have traveled to other parts of the world, that actually make friends with or build up longer, you know, relationships with other researchers or plant breeders right through the world, will give you access to new germplasm. I mean, people will share more germplasm with you if they have a personal relationship with yourself, or actually trust your integrity, or what you bring to the package also is important for them. So networking or networks for me is very important to be a successful breeding company. So I think maybe just to highlight a little bit on what I do see as plant breeding as a career, specifically there in Southern Africa. As I already mentioned, a plant breeder is an architect of plants. You need to have a phenotype or an ideotype, what we refer to, that you think this plant, if you develop it in that way, or you create it in this way, that actually at the end of the day, that a farmer will be interested in purchasing that seed of that specific plant or cultivar to plant on his farm. And as I mentioned, plants or cultivars is important. I mean, without them, you will not be able to actually be a successful seed company. And at the moment, I think I see it is that plant breeders has been a really scarce commodity. Very good, I think, practical plant breeders that's willing to spend a long time in the field going through material, that's got an eye for the material, is not as always available. And I think at the moment there is a kind of a shortage locally, and I think also internationally. So a lot of companies are competing, trying to source and keep the best plant breeders in the company to make them successful. And as I already mentioned, plant breeding is a long-term commitment. You know, it's not something that happens over time, on a short period of time. So I think breeders need to be able to spend and be very, I put lots of hours developing new varieties, and I think also gaining experience, because I mean, you need to have an understanding of soil science, you need to have an understanding of insects, you have to have an understanding of plant physiology, quality of this product that you want to release. So there's so many dynamics that you need to actually get experience in to be able to make a contribution or develop a cultivar that I think would actually be, commercialized. So for me, therefore, that's why I started with Dr. Borlock and Raj, is that I think the better your mentorship is, the quicker you will get to a point where you actually will develop cultivars that will make an impact. I mean, if you're on your own and you have to learn by trial and error, it will take you much longer. So normally I think it takes about 10 years or 15 years to get, develop from an unexperienced breeder to an experienced breeder. But if you have good mentorship, you can maybe cut down that period to 10 years or 9 years. And I think therefore, for me, the lack at the moment in South Africa or Southern Africa to a certain extent is good mentorship. I mean, previously I started at the ARC, and then from the ARC, experienced breeders in the ARC that I could learn from, that I can actually use as a soundboard to test my ideas, not to make mistakes, because in plant breeding, if you make mistakes, the impact of that mistake you will only see in 3 or 4 years from now, or even longer. And then, it's a lot of school money to pay if you don't have, if you make that type of really serious mistakes, and you get to a point where that variety or cultivar you have developed is really will not have an impact, or there's no commercial value to that. So mentorship, I think, is getting a problem in many countries where you get good mentors that's training your plant breeders. And I think a lot of them are, at the moment, are actually in private companies to a certain extent, and not so more in your parastatals, etc. I think for me, the characteristics to be a really good typical plant breeder, you need to have a good eye for phenotype. I mean, it's not everybody that likes going through thousands and thousands of the same wheat varieties. For some people, wheat looks the same like the next one. But if you've got a good eye, you will see the differences between different varieties. You will understand, what you are seeing. Is that important? Is that something you can use? Is that something, if that variety is not 100% adapted for South Africa, you can actually then, need to cross it with something else. Let's take, for instance, the stem resistance or type of disease resistance that's not in the current phenotype you actually are developed. So you need to improve that. So a good phenotype, a good eye for the phenotype for me is really, really important as a plant breeder. You need to have, I think, really good leadership skills. You need to be able to manage a team, to also let that team believe in what you want to achieve at the end of the day. You need to take them down the road. You need to, motivate them to see your bigger picture of what you want to achieve. If you don't get that right, it's really difficult to make progress. And I think it's much slower than if you work on your own and you cannot motivate your team to also believe in what you want to achieve at the end of the day. Then I think you also need to be able to see the bigger picture. You need to understand, for the variety you are developing, will that have an impact in the economy? Will that have an impact to the farmers? Would it interest farmers to purchase seed of that specific variety? So you need to understand what's happening in the country you're breeding for. I mean, is there changes that's happening now immediately? Do you need to, actually change your breeding process? Let's take, for instance, climate changes. Is that something that you need to address? Or, will that still be in effect in 20 years from now? Because then you need to do something about it. But if it's only maybe for a year or two, is it then worthwhile spending a lot of money developing a variety or change a variety to actually address that shortage? If that's, depending on the impact of what you want to do. I think for me also, emotional intelligence for a plant breeder is really important. You need to be understanding how people are actually operating. How can you work together with your team, understand the dynamics of your team? How do you actually motivate your people to get the best out of them? And so for me, really important, emotional intelligence is sometimes even more important than just pure intelligence per se. And I think you have to have passion for technology. I think nowadays, as Lukesh already mentioned, there's so many technology available. Our cell phones today is a computer on its own. And I think there's lots of exciting technology out there that can be used by plant breeders to improve the varieties that they develop. You need to be precise, detail-orientated. You're working with lots of numbers. You need to plan those numbers. You need to harvest those numbers. Mistakes is the biggest concern, I think, for any breeding program. There could be easily a shift in the way you plant and the way you're harvesting, and then you will get the wrong results with the wrong variety, and definitely make the wrong choices in selecting the right variety. And I think perseverance is definitely also a big characteristic for me. You need to be able to spend long hours in the field, going through material, selecting material, sometimes very hot, specifically in Africa or Southern Africa, temperatures up to 40 degrees Celsius, and you'll be willing to spend from early morning to late afternoon going through material and still be excited at the end of the day, even if you're tired. And I've seen so many students starting out as plant breeders, but you can immediately see that, you know, that's not fun for them in the sun. And unfortunately, everything cannot be done for me. I'm still an old school breeder or plant breeder that needs to still be time in the field and feed on the soil to see what's going on, and then link that what you see on the computer. I think the second pivotal point for me is then germplasm. I mean, for us, there's two main crops. It's cross-fertilized crops like maize and sunflower, and then your self-fertilized crops like wheat, barley, oats, and lupins, for instance. I mean, first, like cross-fertilized crops is normally hybrids. You cannot retain the seed, so it's a much more profitable crop, and therefore a lot of your companies or your multinationals are investing heavily in maize and sunflower because they are actually assured that they will get the money back that they invested in selling the products that they develop. But it's also a very highly competitive market because a lot of the big players are playing in this market. So if you look at the self-fertilized crops, I mean, the varieties there, you can keep and retain the seed, what we call farm-safe seed. And so, I mean, a lot of the time in South Africa, farmers will only, for wheat, for instance, only buy, I would say, a third or 10 or 20% of the seed on an annual basis, and that they will use to actually multiply to have and plant for the next year. As Lakeshi said, it is their right to do so. We as a private company or a seed company needs to be taking cognizance of that and also have that into our planning of making a profit with those varieties is much more difficult. So the margins are lower. You need to sell more seed. You cannot actually also increase the price of the seed because then farmers will just keep more seed back. So it is less competitive crops, and there's less role players in your self-fertilized crops. But I think it's wonderful for what we have achieved in South Africa with SACTA. You know, as private companies, actually now suddenly you tripled or doubled your income from these crops by, you know, farmers are willing to pay then a royalty on, you know, when they deliver their seed at the delivering point. And so that enables us to invest in more technology and also increase our profits for the specific crop. And I mean, I've just mentioned a while ago in the chat box, you know, a few years ago it was only Pannar, the Small Grain Institute, and Syngenta that was, or Sensaco that stage that were developing wheat varieties. Since SACTA, you know, Lima Grain had also now approached the market. Don Mario's also approaching the market, and there's some other role players also that is actually now trying to release varieties or wheat varieties for the South African market. So I think a system like SACTA actually creates more competition, and the more competition you have, the better varieties you are motivated to develop better varieties, which would actually benefit our producers, you know, going forward. Just as a sample of infrastructure, I mean, there's just in our case, Sensaco, we've got basically two farms. The one is in Bethlehem, which is about 450 hectares. The other one is in Napier, about 50 hectares at the bottom. So the one is based in the Western Cape up, and the other one is in Bethlehem, part of the Free State. So we have different greenhouses, tunnel sizes. We have got a seed treatment plant, a cleaning plant in Bethlehem. We've built that about 4 years ago. We've got analytic laboratories in Bethlehem. We do a lot of our germplasm development for the summer crops and the winter crops up in the north. We've got a technical service department there, also mechanicals, you know, guys planting our farm, because we also farm our farm commercially to kind of generate some income to subsidize the plant breeding. efforts we're putting in. And down in Napier is a much smaller farm. It's next to the town, but there we have our double upright facility. We're doing a little bit of oats and barley there, and our biggest market is now currently down in the Cape. So for us, that breeding program is really important, to have an active breeding program in that area. I mean, it's really difficult sometimes to breed what we call distance breeding if you're not active in the area yourself, and you gain your experience in the area where you want to develop the cultivars for. This is some of the tools we're looking at the moment. I mean, if you look at those small combines at the right, at the bottom here, I mean, at the moment, they cost between 2.5 to 3 million rands for a small combine. It's even double the amount that you normally pay for a commercial combine. So it's a big investment for a company to make. But you need to have these type of tools to actually handle the numbers. If you look at on the plots, it needs to be harvested, and then you need to actually keep seed back for quality, and they put that through the analytical lab. So, I mean, it's important to be able to purchase these type of technology and planters and software and new technology that's coming available. If you look at this slide, this is just the trials we had this year on the left hand. For Marble Hall, for the irrigation areas, there's about 1,500 different entries we're testing in this specific group. But there you can also see some, plots are earlier or a little bit yellower. Is that maybe earlier material, or is that maybe that there was, if you look at that, could be a package problem on the irrigation or nozzle at that, and you need to be able to understand, has that specific plot there been discriminated again? Because if it is, then you need to be able to make adaptations, or be able to make improve or look at the yield or make changes, or add yield for this specific variety. So there's a lot of technology available nowadays, software, drip systems, where farmers are actually using GPS, where they do their nutritions on the farm itself, or the way they put out their fertilizer. If you can get that information, you link it up to software programs, you can actually go and select the best spot under this pivot for your trials, where you will know that you will get good genotype environment interaction, that you actually will look at the cultivar's performance and not at the environment effect on that yield. So I think within Syngenta, since we've been acquired by them, I think there's drone technology, there's satellite images, there's a lot of new stuff that's coming available that we will implement in our program going forward, that I do believe will help us to actually develop better varieties. As I already mentioned, your tools and technology that's available. I mean, at the moment for the Syngenta side, we just deregulated the AgriSure, there's some drought tolerance corn hybrids that we want to look for, commercializing for South Africa. That's not a GMO. For optimal water usage, the second one is AgriSure Vetera. That's a quattro stack. Four GMO invents in one hybrid. That has just been deregulated a month ago. So we will then be, in the next year or two, commercialize varieties with above ground insect tolerance to various insects, combined with Roundup resistance. I think that will have a lot of value for South Africa going forward. I think you need to have access to very extensive international germplasm libraries on various crops if you really want to be a big player within a country in developing your cultivars. You need to have access to world-class biotechnology platforms. For instance, I already mentioned on genomic selection, gene editing, where you can actually kick out or eliminate certain genes that could have a negative impact on the performance of a specific variety. I mean, gene editing in Europe has been seen as GMOs, and there's a big debate on that. I think in South Africa, there's not a decision taken yet. So it would be really a sad day if the South African government also sees gene editing as a GMO technology. I think that will actually benefit us a lot if you can have access to that type of technology and developing varieties going forward. You need to have world-class access to trait integration if you really want to be in a GMO game, and platforms that you can utilize, to put these traits into the backgrounds of the varieties that you want to commercialize. You need to have double upright facilities. I think specifically for wheat and for maize, we got a small double upright facility down in the Cape, but if you look at what's been offered within a company like Syngenta, then that scale of what they're doing for double uprates is mind-boggling. I mean, it's 6 or 7 or 8 or 10 times investment that we could afford as a small private company. I think, as I said, also for what could be the challenges for us, you know, as a typical seed company when we were still part in SACO or a smaller private company, you know, long-term breeding is a long-term investment and it's an expensive investment. So you will invest now today, but will only be able in 10 years or 15 years from now to commercialize any varieties if you don't license them, if you actually need to develop them from scratch. And so it's a long, and you need to invest for 10 or 15 years before you will actually get an income back. And I think that's something to consider for a seed company because it is an expensive exercise. You need to have the right product portfolio. I mean, in our case, in SACO, we were mainly, our core crop was wheat. So we had started, you know, diversifying in summer crops, but to compete like, you know, against the bigger role players, Corteva and Bayer, it's quite difficult. We didn't have the funds, you know, to actually be able to compete on the level they've been performing. So, and then also, I mean, if you only have 1 or 2 crops that you sell, it makes it difficult, you know, for yourself to be having a whole marketing team for only 1 crop for 6 months of the year. What do you do with the marketing team for the rest of the time? GMO versus non-GMOs. I mean, there's a lot of debate about that. I do believe personally that, you know, GMOs does create a lot of value. If you look at the maize crop and the yield increases that you have seen for maize varieties or hybrids over the last 15 years in South Africa or 20 years since GMOs had been, you know, released in South Africa, it's then, you know, the yield performance of these varieties had significantly increased compared to somebody like, or some crops like wheat, for instance, where no GMOs are currently operating in the crop. I think your route to market is really important. I mean, for us in SACO, we had licensed to certain co-ops which had, you know, selling the product on our behalf, and we will then get a license fee back from them. Or you can go directly to the market, but for that you will need to have either a marketing team in place or you need to have agents in place. So agents are not always as loyal to you as a company as your own person staff that you're paying a salary for. But you need to balance everything out to see what is your best route to market to make the most profit and to be profitable as a seed company. As I already mentioned, you have marketing teams, or you will have agents that you market your material through, or you will have a third party. In some instances, we're still using that model, and down in the Western Cape, where you market through your co-ops, they have direct access to the farmers, and we only supply them then with breeder seed and foundation seed, which they, or base seed that they will multiply and then sell onwards to the farmers. But yeah, if you have a license model, you will make less money, but then also your risk is lower because the input costs or the cost generating that seed is then actually lying with the co-op. So there's always that balance also between where and what you want to do and the risk as you go private, as your own company, doing everything yourself, the risk is getting higher. While with licensing your material, the risk is much lower. And then again, you know, local companies versus multinational companies, you know, that's also, I think, important, because if you're part of a multinational company, it gives you access to lots of biotechnology, new germplasm, while with a local company, you need to have agreements in place with other people working in the same crop in other places of the world or in the same company, in the same country, to actually get access to germplasm or technology, or share some of the costs that you can actually maybe outsource to somebody to do it on your behalf to save costs. I think the scale of investment or the return of the investment is also important. As smaller companies, it's really difficult to get that balance right, because I think your cost of goods of running a company is quite high, normally in the case of 70 to 80% sometimes, while with your bigger companies, then it's much less. I would say at least 20 to 30% in input costs to get to the same point where you will release a variety. Okay, then protection of IP is very important for me, as already mentioned by Lukeshni, and then doing business with government or commercialized farmers is also important. A lot of the African countries, you will have to buy, you know, you need to sell the seed to the government, they will distribute it to the producers, and then sometimes it takes a long time for them to pay you as a company, and you need to be able to carry that. While if you sell to the commercial farmers, you sell directly, you know that you get your money in the bank, and it's maybe a less safer, or it's a safer option, but maybe then also sometimes you will not take market share because the big market is through the government itself. Commercials, you know, versus subsistence farmers also have an impact on the way you do business. And I think the input cost for producing crops is really expensive. If you just look at fertilizer this year, and you look at chemicals or, you know, herbicides, it's tripled this year for South African farmers. It's, you know, you can't put up your seed prices always to the same extent that it's costing you to produce that seed. And that will have an impact on your profit margins for your company. Genotype-environment interaction is really important. I think it actually can, you know, affect the performance of a variety. So you need to have varieties that can handle this to be able to produce a good yield under most circumstances or years and localities. And bundling of products for multinationals, I think, is very easy because you can put certain seed treatments on the seed and get it in, and then sell it to the farmers on the seed that you're selling to get it maybe a cheaper option for the farmers, or looking at options where you can actually give cash back on farmers where they use more products, you know, within your company, and it makes it worthwhile for the producer and then yourself. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. This is just the background for Sensaku. I mean, we had like 200 years of experience currently in our breeding team for wheat. Most probably the most experienced wheat breeding team in Southern Africa. We've got highly skilled people. At the moment, we've got 75% of the market share in South Africa and about 35% in Zambia and 90% in Namibia. And we've got before we were acquired by Syngenta, we worked together with about 30 international companies on a global scale. I think if you look at your traditional multinationals, you can see the amount of people they employ, the relationships they have, the kind of money they spend on a daily basis, and you can see the kind of infrastructures they have globally, and that's just what help you actually, you know, be successful as a seed company. For us as Sensaku, I mean, could still grow organically and develop varieties and could still, you know, we're a profitable company, but I think the impact would have been much slower and it would have taken much longer. For us to take the next level of the company to the next level, we sold them to Syngenta, which gave us then access to diverse summer crop germplasm, which we needed critically to build a business and diversify the business. If we only would have stayed in wheat hectares were decreasing in South Africa on an annual basis, and then maybe in 10 or 15 years from now, we would have out of business, or I mean, the area would have been so small that we could not survive. We got access to tools and technology that were, you know, available within Syngenta. That was very exciting for us. Yeah, and I think if I just to summarize, I truly believe that as a strong group of people, one can accomplish really much more. You can get larger, you can get farther and greater and significantly more progress than what you can do as an individual alone. And just to end by saying of Helen Keller is, alone we can do so little, together we can do so much. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Francois. That was so interesting and so comprehensive. So it was fascinating. I think that there will be a lot of questions. I see there are a couple in the chat already, but we will leave that for the discussion at the end. We'll just move on. We are a little bit behind time, but don't worry, we'll make it up, and there is time to talk amongst ourselves in the discussion. So our next presenter is Dr. B.M. Prasanna. He's the director of the Global Maize Program at the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center, Summit, of course. And he also directs the CGIAR research program Maize. He provides technical oversight for an array of multi-institutional projects on development and deployment of elite stress resilient and nutritionally enriched maize varieties in the tropics of sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Besides the application of novel tools and technologies for enhancing genetic gains and breeding efficiency, he has been leading Summit's efforts together with international and national partners in tackling the challenges of maize lethal necrosis in Africa, and of course the fall armyworm in both Africa and Asia. He's presently leading one CGIAR's plant health initiative formulation together with global partners. And today, he will be addressing research partnerships for Food Secure Africa. So over to you, Dr. Prasanna. Looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much, Christine. I hope you can hear and see the slides.
We can hear, see you and the slides.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Okay, thanks a lot. I think these are excellent set of presentations from diverse perspectives. We have seen from the policy angle, from the institutional arrangements, from the IP perspective, from the private sector perspective. I think it is time for CGIAR to present what do we perceive as important for a food secure Africa. There are three converging challenges. Climate change is the number one and the most important challenge that is already happening, and it's a big elephant in the room. Population growth is another major challenge, and limited and fragile natural resources. So we have to produce better food and more food with much lesser natural resources and for a growing population. That's a biggest challenge that we face. And there is no magic bullet. We do need an array of interventions, including improved stress resilient and nutritionally enriched crop varieties, plus sustainable intensification practices, plus enabling policies. All three have a tremendous role to play in the fight against those three major challenges. And we, at the same time, need diversity of crops, not just cereals, but also pulses, fruits, vegetables, both at the farm and landscape levels. So genetic diversity, plant breeding, farming systems work, and increasing impacts through enabling policies are all very, very important, coupled with capacity development and much stronger partnerships amongst an array of institutions involved in this work. Increasing expectations are there from the crop breeding programs. On one hand, we do need client preferred products more and more, breeding high yielding varieties that are adapted to climate change related stresses with farmer preferred traits, with resistance to major biotic threats, and with enhanced nutritional and end-use quality. So breeders' work is never over. It's a continuous task. No matter how powerful the technologies may come in, the need for a good eye and the need for a good ear and need for practical plant breeding will always remain. Effective use of modern tools, on the other hand, can enable you to accelerate genetic gains per unit investment by exploiting greater functional diversity, greater selection intensity at a much lower cost, increasing the precision of your selections, and accelerating the breeding cycles. All are very important, and there are very powerful technologies that have emerged over the last 15 to 20 years that enable us to utilize this in breeding strategies. The strength of a crop breeding program is undoubtedly a function of the germplasm resources available, the ability to implement high quality phenotyping in relevant selection environments, access to game-changing technologies to drive genetic gain, adequately trained personnel to conduct quality research, coupled with data handling tools and skills. So no organization can succeed in plant breeding business if it stays completely inward focused. There have to be partnerships, no matter how powerful we are. Partnerships are key for evolution of breeding programs. Improving breeding efficiency has to happen on multiple fronts. On one hand, germplasm base is fundamental for breeding success. We also need tools and technologies to drive genetic gains, and there has to be constantly an eye towards continuous improvement, both on widening your germplasm base as well as making that funnel much more sharper through new tools and technologies. So high throughput and precise phenotyping, speed breeding. In maize, we have the double haploid technology, marker discovery, validation, and deployment pipeline, genomic selection or prediction, genome editing, breeding data management, and decision support tools, transgenes, wherever they are relevant and applicable in your strategies. They are all powerful technologies to improve breeding efficiency. To me, the most important thing undoubtedly is the capacity for phenotyping and the network that you have in relevant target population of environments. So having dedicated phenotyping sites with well-designed protocols, continuously upgrading the facilities there so that you improve the precision. FASWA has just now talked about the role of mechanization is extremely important there. Precision management in terms of recording your data with much lesser subjectivity and better precision. That means you need to have harmonized protocols, not just you having that, but your partners too, following similar protocols and getting the data organized and generated in an efficient manner. And digital data capture, taking away the need for manual data recording, are all extremely important in our capacity to improve phenotyping. While genotyping has evolved much more strongly and the cost of genotyping has fallen down significantly over the years, phenotyping still remains a major challenge for many institutions. And this is where much of the focus needs to be put in. CIMMYT is fortunate to have partnerships with a large number of national partners, as well as the private sector institutions in Latin America, in Africa, as well as in Asia. And these partners enable us to phenotype for various traits that are important for our product profiles, including disease resistance, drought tolerance, heat tolerance, low nitrogen tolerance, combinations of abiotic stresses like drought plus heat or drought plus waterlogging, nutritional quality traits. These are all fundamental for the tropical maize improvement. And without partnerships, CIMMYT could not have succeeded in developing such a strong pipeline of products. And we have to recognize the role that is played by national partners, as well as a number of private sector institutions that partner with CIMMYT on the germplasm phenotyping or testing network. Ultimately, the power of the plant breeding programs is reflected in your capacity to unravel genetic variation for key traits like, for example, the drought tolerance. The managed stress phenotyping for drought tolerance need to clearly show the difference between a drought tolerant hybrid or an inbred line and a drought susceptible inbred line next to each other and with precision and with high heritability. Similarly, if you have such systems established for heat, that is going to be extremely relevant. Water logging, for example, at our Hyderabad site, we have a powerful water logging phenotyping capacity there. So all these are very, very important in our strategy towards developing impactful products. And over the years, we also enhanced our capacity to increase the throughput of our phenotyping, not just precision, but also throughput, and ensuring consistency of data collection throughout a screening network to achieve high heritabilities, decreasing the subjectivity, reducing the cost for data collection, shortening the time to data analysis, and help create predictive variables for grain yield and other key traits. So for example, at our CIMMYT Zimbabwe station, we use both proximal and remote sensing tools to characterize our maize genotypes for several traits, including ear traits and the plant traits under managed stress. And training our technicians on digital data capture is extremely important. They are the key workforce, and we do need to enable them to understand and utilize the modern tools in terms of data capturing. We also created, through projects in Africa, regional collaborative maize breeding and seed systems networks so that the population improvement can be independent for a national program or a seed company, but they can always benefit out of the CGIAR maize population improvement programs. There has to be bilateral exchange in terms of donor development and trait in progression. And then from the stage 3 onwards, stage 1 to 3, we do it in our phenotyping and germplasm testing network. From stage 4, regional on-station testing and regional on-farm testing is done jointly between CGIAR, NARS, seed companies. Amongst the CG centers, this is perhaps the biggest network in terms of not just involving simply CGIAR and NARS, but CGIAR, NARS, SME or seed company network. That to me is a much more powerful combination in terms of bringing together both public and private sectors in in 2007, we derived the second generation tropically adopted haploid inducers with more than 10% haploid induction rate and excellent adaptation to the tropical environments. And this is again a very important tool in breeders' armory in terms of not just reducing the time required to develop genetically homozygous lines, but also in combination with molecular markers, you can go forward with the forward breeding or genomic prediction to significantly accelerate genetic gains. And again, here you can see the partnership between CIMMYT, national programs, and private sector, not only in Africa, but also in Latin America. So out of over 2,005% from national partners and about 50% or 47% from CIMMYT. So this is again achieving economy at scale and providing a powerful service, DH development service for the benefit of national partners as well as the seed companies which have breeding programs. We have a similar facility now coming up in India at Kunigal in Bangalore. Right now I am in Bangalore, which is just 70 kilometers from here, and it will be inaugurated next month. And this is again a state-of-the-art double haploid facility for Asia. So with this, we covered all the 3 continents, Africa, Latin America, and Asia. Marker-assisted breeding, we have a very strong marker discovery validation deployment pipeline for an array of traits that are relevant for breeding programs, right from ear rots, rust, stalk rots, triga, kernel zinc. But 5 particular traits we are already deploying through forward breeding or marker-assisted backcrossing in some cases. These include the provitamin A trait, maize streak virus MSV, maize lethal necrosis, haploid induction rate, and the Tarsicum leaf blight in case of Asia. Several other traits are in the process of validation or discovery. This is just an example to show discovery of a very stable and robust QTL on chromosome 6 has enabled us to transfer it to 52 elite drought-tolerant but MLN susceptible lines and converting them into MLN resistant versions. This is a massive marker-assisted backcrossing project that we undertook with remarkable effects in terms of, you can see here, CML442, an excellent drought-tolerant line, but highly susceptible to MLN, and converted line with excellent resistance to MLN under Naivasha. Similarly, 569 and the converted line, and so on and so forth. So this is a practical demonstration that markers could be a very powerful tools in your breeding strategy, provided you go through a typical process of discovery, validation, and then deployment of breeder-ready markers. Genome editing, therefore, we started off in collaboration with Corteva based on the work that has been done. initially, and discovery of the chromosome 6 QTL, and the fine mapping, cloning, and editing of the causal genomic region has progressed very significantly thanks to the excellent work done by Korteva. We are now establishing a pipeline to undertake genome editing for MLN resistance in some of the MLN susceptible lines that are parents of CIMMYT-derived commercial maize hybrids in Africa. This is indeed the first case where genome editing is being used in maize in the tropical environments for improvement of a very important trait that is really important for smallholders' livelihoods and food security. Genomic selection and prediction, wherever the traits are complex and they are not controlled by a few genes with major effects, is really critical, whether it is for drought tolerance or heat stress tolerance or waterlogging tolerance and so on. It will enable you to predict and select untested lines as well as untested hybrids and undertake population improvement through rapid cycle recurrent selection. Again, a lot of work done by CIMMYT in Africa on empirically testing genomic selection versus phenotypic selection and proving conclusively that tropical maize populations could be improved significantly by undertaking genomic selection or prediction in sub-Saharan African environments. But the key finally is not just varietal releases, but varietal impacts. The products that meet diverse demands of stakeholders, including farmers and seed companies, are extremely important. But more important also is rapid scaling and wider adoption of stress-tolerant varieties, as I have seen in the chart box. At the same time, it's not just about quantity, but also about quality. QA/QC is really important throughout the seed value chain, and accelerated varietal turnover, replacement of older and obsolete varieties or climate vulnerable varieties with climate resistant or resilient versions is extremely key for improving crop productivity, not just in maize, but in any other crop for that matter. We have seen some remarkable successes in the recent years through projects like stress tolerant maize for Africa. In 2020, certified seed production of CGIAR-derived related stress-tolerant improved maize varieties has reached 134,000 tons. This is almost like from 70,000 tons in 2016 to 134,000 tons in 2020 is really a matter of great pride for us. Now, these varieties cover about 5.5 million hectares. Reaching an estimated 9.4 million households and benefiting nearly 65 million people across 13 countries. But most importantly, it's also about area-weighted average age of CGIAR-related maize cultivars. You can see here, it's if you look at Eastern Africa, from 14 years in 2014-15, now it has been reduced to 10.32 across the 4 target countries. In Malawi, Mozambique, Zambia, Zimbabwe, it's even better. We have gone down to 9.78. But West Africa, there is still a lot of work to be done, especially in countries like Ghana and Mali, where some of the very, very old CGIAR-related improved open pollinated varieties are still there in the market, are still being commercialized, and they need to be replaced with better and newer genetics. The seed production technology for Africa is another powerful example of a research partnership to reduce the cost of goods sold and make seed business much more powerful and more lucrative to the companies and ultimately benefit the farmers with improved products. So this technology, a very elegant technology derived by colleagues at Korteva, there is a partnership now between Korteva, CIMMYT, KALRO, ARC South Africa, and this is a dominant male sterile gene, MS44, linked to a color marker, a transgenic method, but the ultimate product will be a male sterile female inbred line, which is non-transgenic. So this very elegant seed production technology for Africa, we are expecting products to come out of that within the next 1 to 2 years or so. So a lot of groundwork has already happened. Conversion of some of the CIMIT inbred lines into male sterile versions has been done. The non-pollen producing lines have been compared against the pollen producing lines, and there is a remarkable improvement in terms of maintaining purity as well as improving the productivity. Then another model that we started off in Asia was the International Maize Improvement Consortium with seed companies, several seed companies, and as well as the national partners. And this consortium works towards developing and deriving improved CIMIT germplasm based on the needs of the seed companies and their market segments, and at the same time establishing a regional collaborative testing network with contributions from partners. And this model has been successfully running for 11 years, and it has been initiated in Africa in 2018, and it has run already very successfully for the last 3 years. So this is another way, targeted reaching of partners with client preferred traits, and at the same time establishing a powerful collaborative hybrid testing network and providing value added services. Final aspect is about defending genetic gains has become as important as increasing genetic gains. Africa has seen a number of crops, pests and diseases over the last few years. Wheat rust has happened in Africa. Wheat blast happened recently in Asia, in Bangladesh. Fall armyworm is a story that we all know. MLN is another. Banana bunchy top virus, bacterial wilt, fusarium wilt race TR4, cassava brown streak virus, papaya mealybug, potato cyst nematode, taro blight. So there are a number of incidences of transboundary pathogens and pests attacking major food crops and causing a global burden. And the risk of pesticide pollution at the global scale is indeed a matter of serious concern to the stakeholders and to all of us. The fall armyworm, for instance, is such a complex pest. It cannot be tackled by any one single solution in a sustainable way. So unless appropriate actions are taken, fall armyworm has the potential to continue to cause major losses to the maize smallholders. And it requires an integrated pest management strategy where host plant resistance has to work together with environmentally safer pesticides, scouting and surveillance, biological control, agroecological management. So recently we brought out this guide for Asia too, similar to the one which we brought out in 2018 for IPM, for fall armyworm control in Africa. BT maize is one of the powerful tools in the toolbox against a pest like fall armyworm, as well as for stem borers. And the efficacy of BT maize is no doubt at all against Spodoptera, for example, Monate 9034. Monate 10 is not so well suited against fall armyworm, but Monate 9034 is definitely a much better event. And the TAILA partnership is running very strong. AATF, Bayer, CIMIT, national partners from 7 different countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And let's hope that outside South Africa too, there'll be countries which will be releasing BT maize events in the near future. Nigeria and Kenya are showing tremendous promise in this regard. But I'm going to talk very briefly about the power of native genetic resistance. When this pest hit Africa in 2016, we established this facility in 2017, a screen house facility, around 13 such huge screen houses to quickly screen CIMIT's germplasm, especially the multiple insect resistant tropical and multiple borer resistant germplasm from CIMIT Mexico. And after intensive screening, we did identify several important inbred lines as well as hybrids, and then screened a set of hybrids under no choice experiments. That means one screen house dedicated to one particular hybrid. You can see here the fall armyworm tolerant hybrids, each plant challenged with artificial infested insects, and there is no choice here. They retain excellent foliage as well as ear bearing capacity compared to the susceptible commercial checks here. And therefore, native genetic resistant hybrids are also a possibility. These hybrids are presently being evaluated under national performance trials in Eastern Africa. Very soon in Southern Africa, this would happen from the forthcoming season, cropping season. And we hope to have the first set of Fala mealworm tolerant hybrids, native genetic resistant hybrids released in 2022. So in summary, friends, there are several powerful tools: genomics assisted breeding, genome editing, speed breeding, precision phenotyping, machine learning, and artificial intelligence will be increasingly used in plant breeding programs too in the near future. So the choices are there in front of us. Either we do the same, or we make occasional improvements, or show some continuous improvement, but very small incremental improvements, or adopt some powerful technologies and innovations to rapidly accelerate genetic gains. This is the need of the hour to reinvigorate crop breeding programs in sub-Saharan Africa, not just in sub-Saharan Africa, but in many countries in Asia and Latin America too. I'm not just talking about maize. I'm talking in general about crop breeding programs. This requires, as Shimelis presented in the very beginning, the demand-led breeding is fundamental. Well-defined breeding strategy with clear product concepts and focus on monitoring and increasing genetic gains, rigorous stage gate advancement process, and not just giving importance to varietal releases per se, but actually demonstrated impacts of these varieties in the farmers' fields. So with that, I would like to end that this is a remarkable book about a lady whom I tremendously admire, and that is Barbara McClintock. Evelyn Fox Keller wrote this fantastic book about 20 years back on Barbara McClintock, talking about a feeling for the organism, the life and work of Barbara McClintock. We need to ask ourselves, are our young scientists having that feel for the organism, having that feel for those crop plants on which they are working on, have the capacity to persevere and make a difference? So that's the kind of new generation of young scientists that crop breeding programs need to produce and mentor. And then we can be successful as institutions and not just as individuals. So scientists with a passion, perseverance, and commitment to make a difference are increasingly needed in the present day world when we have to face several converging challenges. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dr. Prasanna. That's an impressive overview. Thank you. I think that is, well, it already has inspired a couple of questions that are sitting in the chat box ready for you for later, but we'll get to those. I'm now going to hand over to our next speaker, Prof. Mark Lang, who, if you have been involved in the ACCI at UKZN, needs no introduction. But I will give him a little one nonetheless. So Prof. Lang is going to speak to us about climate change and plant breeding, another big meaty topic. And he established the ACCI in 2001 at UKZN and has trained 126 PhD graduates so far. Funded by AGRA, its mandate was to train 120. So it has overreached. It's released over 220 cultivars, over 200 publications, and then within the discipline of plant pathology at UKZN, Prof. Lang has managed a range of research projects. He's currently supervising 32 postgraduate students. He collaborates across multiple disciplines, notably plant breeding, of course, but also grassland science, microbiology, virology, entomology, animal science, food security, nematology, genetics, biochemistry, agricultural engineering, almost you name it. He has 226 publications to his name. He's personally supervised or co-supervised to graduation 84 PhD graduates, 86 MScs, 126 honors students, and is currently supervising postdoctoral researchers as well as 16 PhD candidates and 16 MSc candidates. And he is also in the top 30 of our published researchers at UKZN, which is an amazing achievement, consistently. So his research interests include plant breeding, of course, so African food security crops, biofuel crops, ornamentals, and then integrating plant breeding and biocontrol, particularly of striga in cereal crops, and then seedlings and cuttings production in vegetable, cassava, and timber, biofuel, biomass, and bioplastics crops for Africa, biocontrol of diseases, pests, and nematodes, post-harvest disease control and fruit agents, in fruit and vegetables, sorry, using biocontrol agents, and then use of silicon as a fertilizer, agricultural engineering projects. There's some very interesting ones he's been involved in. And then, of course, we're going to hear from him on the very topical issue of climate change. So, Prof. Lang, I'm going to hand over to you, and we're really looking forward to this.
Well, greetings to everyone. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to talk about something that I think is so big that it overwhelms everything else. And I think one of the challenges we have is to keep our balance in the face of something on this scale. And one of the areas where we need to keep our balance is as plant breeders. And how do we respond to something on the scale of the current climate crisis, which is really going to change the world as we know it? So, what is going to happen? What can we guess is going to happen? Well, first of all, the Earth is warming faster than it has for millions of years. And as a result, the estimation is that we've really got 9 years to save the Earth and go carbon neutral. So that's by 2030. Can we do that? Frankly, I have my doubts. And then we're talking about 29 years to catastrophe, which is 2050. And with current estimates, we're going to reach 3 degrees centigrade by 2050. Now, if we get there, that sea temperature, that really is catastrophe. And most of the world's ecosystems will have dramatically changed by then. And some estimates are that within 79 years, we're actually looking at the end of human civilization as we know it. And we are facing an existential crisis as to whether we survive or not. So what are we doing about it? Well, frankly, the current responses are pathetic. US, Brazil, Australia, China, India, and South Africa are all pathetic in their responses. South Africa has a Minister of Energy who says, coal is king. He said that this year. Now, in the face of the climate crisis, that's an insane response. The Paris Agreement is our one safety check, but the problem is it's failing. It's not being met. None of the countries are meeting it. There's only one country in the whole world, and it's one of the smallest countries in the world, and it's called the Gambia. That's the only country in the world that's meeting the Paris Agreement. The reality is coal use is increasing and oil exploration is also increasing. So we're not actually dealing with it. We're avoiding it. It's something that we say, other people can deal with it. It will come later. Well, no, it's actually upon us now. Everyone's going to be affected, from Donald Trump to the poorest migrant. And frankly, there's going to be no safe place on Earth. We need a global revolution adopted by all human beings. Otherwise, our existence on Earth will be very dubious. Frankly, the past is over, and the future isn't what it used to be. We all plan on working and then retiring with a retirement fund and then living a comfortable life as a retired person. That future is really at risk. What if the entire financial system of the world collapses? Because climate change has the capacity to do exactly that. Now, if I look at the current world leadership and people like this, including Bolsonaro on the bottom right, who has facilitated the burning of more of the Brazilian rainforests than any president in Brazil ever before, at double the rate of pre his presidency. One has to despair. You can only be pessimistic if this is the current leadership. Where does it come from? It's very simple. Carbon dioxide levels were at around 280 ppm in the 1880s. They're now at 414 level, 414 ppm. And the IPCC, which is following climate change, in 2013, they said we're making faster progress to 2 degrees than predicted. And then 6 years later, they said, well, actually, we're on track for 3 degrees. And as you'll see, 3 degrees is catastrophic. These are the projections that we're looking at. And unfortunately, we're stuck on the red line. And in fact, we're probably exceeding the red line. We know we're near the blue line. So the reality is that we're not managing global warming. Where does most of the greenhouse gases come from? Well, transport's a big one. Electricity, heating, and power is another one. And then, interestingly, agriculture generates something like 32% of the greenhouse gases of the world, which is a fairly large component of greenhouse gases. And clearly, it makes our life difficult in the agricultural world because we need to deal with it. And agriculture cannot stay the same. It cannot remain as high input agriculture. It's going to have to change into low input agriculture. Just looking at the primary sources of carbon dioxide in the world, if we look at coal-fired power stations in China, this is a staggering photograph. I always find it just blows me away. But it's winter time in China and it's cold, and this is a power station there. China uses 51% of the world's coal, and 57% of China's energy comes from coal. Interestingly, South Africa has got one of the highest, if not the highest, percentage of energy coming from coal at 66%. Now, the problem with China is that although they're already the biggest user of coal in the world, they're building new coal-fired power stations at a staggering rate. And it's currently 3 times as many coal-fired power stations than the rest of the world combined. So the president of China recently said, no, they're going to go green and they're going to go sustainable. The reality on the ground is that they haven't backed off at all on building new coal-fired power stations. So that's fairly terrifying. In the last 3 years, their CO2 emissions have gone up 4%. Now, given that they're the biggest producer of CO2, that's pretty scary if it's going up 4% in 3 years. The president said that they would cut emissions after 2035. The problem with that is that it's too late. By 2035, we've reached a state where we can't actually slow down global warming, and we reach a runaway state. Where does the heat go? Well, the reality is that it goes into the oceans. The land only absorbs a bit of the heat. The majority of the heat goes into the oceans. Now, the problem with that is that the oceans take decades to heat up, but they take 200 to 300 years to cool down. So whatever heat has been absorbed by the oceans to this date is there, and we can't get rid of it. We can't remove that heat from the oceans. And so the IPCC in 2019 said climate change is already irreversible due to the heat uptake in the oceans. The scary part, the part that really scares me is that the climate crisis is now moving into a state of positive feedback. And this is what makes me really, really scared. I truly wake up screaming at night. These are processes which feed themselves so that they go faster. And then that causes more acceleration. And because it's gone faster, it causes more acceleration until the entire process explodes. So a good example of this is a nuclear power station, but it's there in dynamite, for example. is a runaway explosion, which is a runaway which starts from one molecule which spreads to the rest of the molecules increasingly fast. So 3 examples of global warming that is accelerating global warming are, first of all, with more global heat, we end up with more water evaporation. That results in more water vapor in the atmosphere. And the problem with that is that water is very good at retaining heat. It creates a blanket around the earth. And so it's a major greenhouse gas. So as we get hotter, we have more water, and that makes us hotter. So then we get more water in the air. So it's a runaway process. The second one is called the albedo effect. And that is that at the moment we've got ice covering most of the North and South Poles and Greenland. The problem is that it's melting. And as it melts, it exposes the dark sea or rocks. And that results in reflections that drop from 70% to 10%. And therefore, there's more heat, and that will drive more melting of the poles. And so therefore, we will have more heat. So again, it's a runaway effect. The third one is that the whole of the Northern Hemisphere is ringed by the Arctic zone. So most of Russia, and then going across to Finland, and then across to Canada and Alaska, there's an entire zone of the Arctic permafrost. And then you have the ocean as well. And this entire region used to be frozen solid, rock hard. The problem is that it's warming up now and it's going soft. And as a result, there's trillions of tons of methane and carbon dioxide that are now being released. And if you go looking, you can see videos of Russian scientists canoeing in lakes in the Arctic zone. And you can see bubbles of methane coming out of the rivers and ponds. And if they light a flame, you can see the methane burning. Now, the problem with that is that methane is 86 times more potent than CO2 as a greenhouse gas. In other words, as a blanket to retain heat on the earth. The real driver, the fundamental driver, the fire that drives the whole process is actually global population. And really, this is the big problem. Carbon dioxide and the greenhouse gases, somebody said, that's actually the petrol that's being poured on the fire, but the fire itself is the global population. As you can see, it was 10,000 years before present. There were only 7 million people. And that took 12,000 years to get to 1 billion. It only then took 127 years to jump to 2 billion. But look at the jump between 2000 and 2012. That's an increase of 1 billion in only 12 years. And already we've jumped to 7.5 billion. What we're looking at is getting to 11.5 billion by the end of 2100. If you look at the main graph, you're all scientists who've worked with graphs like this, and I know you'll all would love to get an R-squared value of 0.9992. That's a staggering correlation between the world population and atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. And it's very simple. People need food, people need heat, and today modern people need electricity. And all of those generate carbon dioxide. So if we look at the carbon dioxide levels on the bottom left, in 1700, these were around 280 ppm. Today, that jumped up to 414, which is 150% up. By 2038, it's estimated it will be at 460. By 2056, at 500 ppm, which is 180% of the starting point before the Industrial Revolution. By 2100, we're looking at 900 ppm. Now that's a 311% jump from where the world started. What impact does this all have on us? Well, first of all, we're looking at very much hotter days on the lands. When we talk about a 3-degree climate change, that's actually the ocean temperature. The reality is that translates to a 6 to 15-degree change on land. And so where you got a country that was going up to 40, perhaps, like Pietermaritzburg sometimes goes up to 40, we're looking at going up to 55 degrees. And that you can see is a quantum jump. You know, it's easy to survive a 40-degree day. It actually becomes difficult to survive a 55-degree day. Ironically, you also get colder days, and we can see this in the freezing experiences in the Northern Hemisphere in particular. And what happens is that the heating disrupts the jet streams. And the jet streams work rather like a cage, and they hold the freezing polar air above the poles. Now, if they are disrupted, it releases freezing polar air, and that results in freezing conditions over the Northern Hemisphere. And this has happened a number of times in the last 10 years. We're seeing increasing droughts, fires, floods and hurricanes. Not only do they happen more often, and the IPCC pointed out that what we can expect is that a 1 in 100-year event will now happen 1 in 3 years. The second problem is that the power of these hurricanes is much higher because the heat in the air and the sea is driving much more powerful windstorms and rainstorms. We're also seeing the ice caps and glaciers melt, and that results in a sea rise. And that impacts on cities and coastal agriculture. We've already seen the seas rise 800 millimeters. We're expecting them to rise by between 1.5 and 3 meters by 2050. And if the poles melt, just the Antarctic ice alone is enough to raise the seas by 70 meters. So you can see that it has a massive impact. The seas themselves are becoming hotter. They're becoming more acid because the carbon dioxide dissolves in the seas and creates carbonic acid. The corals die off and fish stocks diminish. And then as a result, globally, what we're seeing is the failure of ecosystems. And in South Africa, we can see it with the fynbos, which is one of the richest plant ecosystems in the world. And we're already seeing significant extinctions taking place in the fynbos down in the Western Cape at the tip of South Africa. Fires, you've all seen this picture, I hope. I think it's an iconic picture because it's talking about Australia burning, and it's very clear that it's Australia burning. But if we look at this USA, every year California burns. In Europe, every year Greece is burning. Every year South America is burning. Ironically, in 2019, there were more fires in Central Africa than there were in South America. We just don't have the coverage of people in Central Africa that we do on South America. But Africa has a very significant fire problem. We also have a major flood problem, and this is poor Mozambique. It experienced 3 cyclones in a single year in 2019. And it devastated central, north, and southern Mozambique, as well as Zimbabwe and Malawi. So this we can expect to happen more frequently. It's going to impact both Tanzania to the north and South Africa to the south, because there will be more cyclones and they will be more powerful, and they will go north and south. What about the heat effects? Well, on the left-hand side, we can see the Sahel. This is this region here, but it's going right across from West Africa, right across to the Horn of Africa. We're looking at a zone getting substantially hotter. Now, that means it's getting too hot to live there. And without water and with no viable agriculture, there's no food. And if there's no food, people migrate. So we're looking at something like 118 million climate migrants from Africa in the next 10 to 20 years, according to the United Nations Climate Agency. Only yesterday, the IMF pointed out that Africa needs something like 30 to 50 billion per year. This is billion US dollars to adapt to climate change. I wonder where that money is going to come from. On the right-hand side is looking at Southern Africa, and this talk today is focused on Southern Africa. Okay, if you look on the left, that's heat. So you can see the whole central zone of Southern Africa becomes significantly hotter. And that has a huge impact on Southern Africa, but it's also going all the way into Angola, Zambia, Zimbabwe. On the right-hand picture, it's looking at whether regions get wetter or drier. And what's fascinating there and rather terrifying is if you look at my marker, you can see that all the way up the coast, the west coast of Southern Africa, you're getting a dramatic drying effect. And parts of Angola are going to get, and Namibia are going to get substantially drier. Parts of South Africa are on the west are becoming substantially drier. Now, they were already dry, so they've moved from arid, semi-arid to fully arid. In other words, semi-desert to full desert. Southern Africa is heating up at twice the global average. So this is impacting on us very, very seriously. There was a new record in 2019 of 53.2 degrees in South Africa at Voelstrift in Northern Cape. But the west and central Southern Africa becomes fully arid and uninhabitable. We're seeing an expansion of the Kalahari Desert in simple terms. In South Africa, we're seeing the maize triangle at risk. And this is a zone in this region here where a large proportion of South Africa's maize is produced. That's now at risk because it's simply going to become too hot and too dry to produce maize reliably. But across the entire region, we're going to get hotter and drier. And there's nowhere really that's getting wetter. So what does this do for plant breeders? We need to look at what are the key goals that we as plant breeders need to adopt in the face of these terrifying changes. And these are some ideas I'd like to share with you. The first one being that post-harvest is one area where we can have a significant impact relatively quickly. Look at the fact that 40 to 70% of cereal and legume grains are lost to grain pests. Weevils and moths eat half of the food that Africa harvests. So without changing any of the varieties, without adding fertilizer, without changing anything, we can actually double the food in Africa simply by controlling the weevils and moths. And we can do this with breeding, and we can do it with biocontrol. Similarly, with fruit and vegetables, something like 25 to 50% are lost to post-harvest diseases in particular. And again, we can breed for resistance there. With roots and tubers, 20 to 40% of cassava and sweet potato are lost, particularly to PPD with cassava and then molds with sweet potato. We can breed for resistance. It's doable. So my takeaway point there is this is the easiest way to double food availability in Africa. Focus on the post-harvest tolerance and resistance and durability. And also, I'm working on the biological control side, and we need to combine the biocontrol of these pests with the breeders breeding for more resistant varieties. Heat tolerance is clearly going to be a major issue, as will drought tolerance and water use efficiency. And this is where very good phenotyping is absolutely essential. Every research station across Africa needs to have phenotyping facilities to breed for these two factors, heat and drought tolerance. Salinity tolerance, I think, is going to become very important for coastal agriculture because we're going to have the sea broaching estuaries and lowlands. And so we will get more salt in those regions. And we need to be able to be breeding for salt tolerance. Africa has very little nitrogen or phosphate, and that's not going to change rapidly. This is a cost that small-scale farmers can't afford. So we as breeders need to breed for high efficiency so that what little is applied to the land can be used efficiently. And then there's a really interesting area where we can make significant progress, and that's breeding for biological nitrogen fixation. And that's breeding varieties that are compatible with free-living nitrogen-fixing bacteria on cereal crops and rhizobia. As long ago as in the 1980s, scientists in Brazil, like Doberina, showed that they could grow sugarcane with zero nitrogen input, simply the application of these bacteria. And they could get exactly the same yields as though they had put nitrogen fertilizers on. So this is the opportunity that we have. We've shown that you can grow maize, for example, with a 65% reduction in nitrogen fertilizers without any loss of yield. So it's something that as breeders we can breed for compatibility with this spectrum of bacteria. And then we've heard about these pests and diseases. The reality is that with changing climates, we are going to get different spectra of pests and diseases, and we're going to have to change the varieties rapidly as these pests and diseases impact upon us. We've seen all these relatively new diseases, but we've also seen things like CMV and CBSV, new strains. In some cases, we've been told, no, you can't breed for resistance to these. You need to do genetic engineering. The reality is our students of the ACCI have done it in as little as 3 years. And that's combining both resistance to CMV and cassava brown streak virus resistance. So yes, it can be done, and it can be done rapidly. And it can be done on African research stations with relatively simple technology. We've got more land, more people and less land, so it's critical that we accelerate breeding. And we have to maintain the farmer traits if we want farmers to adopt our new varieties. How do we accelerate the breeding of varieties? Shimilis and I published a paper in 2012 looking at how long does it take to breed crops. And what was scary was that it could take you 25 years to release sorghum hybrids, starting from pre-breeding with land races. And one of the big problems was in fact getting the CMS, cytoplasmic male sterility, transferred into the sorghum lines. And one breakthrough that I'd like to recommend to everyone is a chemical called TFMSA. It's readily available through Merck. It's systemic, it's long-acting, and there's no loss of female fertility. And what it allows us to do is to avoid hand pollination. So if you're crossing selfing crops, it makes a dramatic difference to the speed and efficiency of crosses that you make. For example, with legumes. And so it's been used very successfully with soybeans as an example. You don't need emasculation for hybrid production, so we've been able to produce sorghum hybrids successfully using this. And the major thing is that it allows us to eliminate CMS, which is an expensive and difficult thing to maintain. And it also slows down genetic gain because you can't breed in the male sterile line. You have to leave it as it is. So you can only make progress on the male line. We've heard about doubled haploids, and this is wonderful because it eliminates the selfing generations. This is great, but we need the protocols for every crop, not just maize. We need it for all the major crops that we're dealing with in Africa. So I believe that there's a really significant opportunity for research to be done by breeders to create protocols for doubled haploids that are affordable and easy to do. Marker assisted for selection for back crosses can reduce the cycles from 7 down to 2, which is an enormous gain. We've heard about CRISPR-Cas. It's great, but can we do it in Africa with current resources? And how do we get past the political barriers? That would be my question there. And it's true also for GMOs. Can we get past the political barriers or the almost insurmountable hurdles of biosafety requirements that are put in our way? Let's talk about phenotyping. We've heard about rapid phenotyping, but if we look at the equipment that's being used, it's expensive and very difficult to maintain. And I really question whether it's viable for most of the research stations in Africa. And I think that what we need is more affordable, more scalable, simple, and reliable phenotyping facilities. And an example I want to give you is that at the ACCI, we've invented a drought screening facility. It just requires plastic mulch and drip irrigation. And with that, we can screen out the rain and control the level of irrigation that reaches each crop. And there we can do very accurate comparative drought screening. Speed breeding has an enormous advantage. It's being done in Australia and the UK, 6 generations of wheat in 1 year. So my question is, how do we simplify this and how do we make it scalable in Africa? Can we do this, for example, in modified containers? Is this feasible? I'd like to promote modern proteomics to track quantitative polygenic traits. The big problem with polygenic traits is that there are many genes involved, but there's actually only a few proteins involved, and those genes come together to produce these proteins on a quantitative basis. So, for example, we're working on cold tolerance in a timber crop, and we've shown that you can actually track it very easily using proteomics. And it's not expensive, and it's relatively quick. So it's a doable thing, and it has the opportunity to manage polygenic traits. And then the last speed issue is I'd like to promote NIR for quality trait evaluation. I know some of the CG centers are doing it already. And for example, it's looking at something like protein or amino acids, minerals, phytic acid, and cultivar ID. All of these traits can be done for every crop. And there's a revolution happening because these used to cost about $100,000, and now some of this equipment is available at $1,000. The second breakthrough is in the software, which used to be difficult and very difficult to manage, and there are breakthroughs taking place in this area. So all of you working in quality traits, please look at NIR as a dramatic opportunity. We've talked a little bit about viable seed systems for the commercial seed companies, and I would like to point out the difficulty of selfing crops and vegetatively propagated crops. Farmers are allowed to self-propagate, and they also share the seeds of these crops. So the question is, how do we reward plant breeders and seed companies in Africa who invest time and money breeding these crops? I think that the example that we've given from South Africa, where levies are taken, I think that's a great opportunity, but the question is, how would we do that in Africa with small-scale farmers? And then how do we distribute superior new varieties to millions of small-scale farmers? If you take a country like Ethiopia, how do we get a new variety to 95 million farmers? And then the last point there is we need money. Plant breeding costs money. And the problem is that at the moment, we're really dependent on external funding like the Gates Foundation. But in the long term, Africa needs to fund itself. And we need the governments of South Africa to fund these. We also need some of that 30 to 50 billion a year that the developed world has promised to Africa to be applied in the plant breeding. And we need to increase the funding of plant breeding 1,000-fold. And that's for those targets of training new breeders, funding the NAS programs, developing the independent seed systems, and tackling policy and governance barriers. And we need to demand results from the plant breeders and administrators. Africa can't wait any longer. We need results in as little as the next 5 to 10 years. We need dramatic change in the speed that we're operating at. Ultimately, we only have one Earth, and we adapt or we die. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Lang. Sobering stuff, and good food for thought in terms of plant breeding.
But we are so happy that we have quite a number of participants in this workshop. I can close. I think it's yes. About the DLB team and all the speakers and the participants that are present here. You should be thanking them honestly and on behalf of the demand-led plant breeding team, and also us as presenters, as organizers of the event. We really thank you, honestly. It was exhaustive, very detailed presentation by the keynote speakers. We really appreciate your thoughts, your sharing all the guidelines for us. It was excellent conversation all in all. And I think, as I indicated, we have got many lessons and many cases to make the business of plant breeding more attractive to investment, to justify for investment cases. So all in all, we appreciate all the speakers and the participants present here. We have seen many of your comments in the chat box. And also, we are really happy that you are present. We will also organize some events in the future. We'll keep in touch with you. And Kristen also will communicate afterwards in terms of sharing the recordings and necessary documents. We will be sharing this with Dr. Nasir Yao, who is the coordinator, the Pan-African coordinator of the DLB, who will be also putting this into the DLB resources, so you can access them from the website too. So I thank you everyone for the presentation, and listening to all the activities with us. We appreciate your attendance and presence. Thank you very much.